everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very, very excited to chat with you. We have gotten a great topic ready for you today, sustaining employee engagement when the future feels unclear. So we're going to talk about uncertainty and how to navigate that. I am Lauren Winans. I am the CEO and principal consultant of Next Level Benefits. And joining us, we have two team members of mine, also former corporate HR professionals like myself, turned consultants, Ani Kachatourian and Catherine Brune. And we're really excited today to chat with you about ultimately some things that I'm sure that we're all feeling. There's been a lot of uncertainty, over the course of, it feels like forever now. And so that has ultimately impacted all of our roles. And so today I'm going to be guiding our panelists through some questions. And just so that you have a sense of our background, I'm the CEO and principal HR consultant of Next Level Benefits HR Consulting. I was formerly in corporate HR roles at a variety of different organizations prior to starting this business about 6 years ago. Very fortunate to be able to contribute to a variety of media outlets and work with a variety of different clients through our work with Next Level Benefits. Both Catherine and Ani are members of our team. They are independent HR consultants as well. And so very happy to have them today. Catherine is a former corporate HR professional at SunTrust. She's also a faculty member at Georgia Tech. She's teaching career development fundamentals and a variety of other things to inquiring minds. And she has a special expertise specifically in employee engagement and creating cultures of well-being. Ani, also a very valued member of our team. She is a former corporate HR professional at a variety of organizations, specifically Thrive Market, Aspiration, and a variety of others listed there. She also has special expertise in organizational development and communicating change. So thank you both for being here. Really appreciate your time and looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
Great, happy to be here.
Excited to get this going.
Thank you. So before we jump in, just a little bit more about us so that, you're like, what's Next Level Benefits? Is this about benefits? No, it's more than that. So like I said, I started this business about 6 years ago. Our mission is to serve as an on-demand extension of your HR team. So we are focused on supporting clients of all sizes, all industries across the US, really serving as that extension of your team, working alongside you to deliver on different projects that you might have, fill gaps on your team, as well as, insert ourselves as fractional support during busy times of your year. And our game plan is ultimately to be that seamless extension that really kind of works alongside to get work done. Our team of professionals, including Ani and Catherine, we all have corporate HR experience from a variety of organizations, including Fortune 500 companies, global brands from around the world. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started here on the topic. Today's discussion is focused on sustaining employee engagement when the future feels unclear. And ultimately, we looked for this conversation to be just that, a conversation. I have some questions I'm going to be asking Ani and Catherine, but we hope that you will also add some questions to the chat so that you can share your thoughts as well as ask any questions that you might have on the content that we're discussing today. And to just kind of give you some insights into what we're going to be talking about specifically today, we're going to be focusing on primarily three main areas. We're going to be talking about how to maintain that engagement amid a lot of change, right? So when we think about change, we're thinking of it in a variety of different capacities. We're thinking about it in terms of economic shifts, organizational changes, evolving technology like AI, and global uncertainty. So unfortunately, all of those things are at play in our daily lives every day. And so how can we as HR professionals really maintain employee engagement? How as we as leaders can engage our employees during times where things might not be so clear? We're also going to be focused on fostering resilience through transparent communication and leading with empathy. And we will also talk in more depth around supporting employees who are navigating as survivors after a layoff. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of layoffs in the last few years, but particularly the last handful of months, and many HR professionals that are, still within their organization, trying to navigate through what's next, really could, use some insights and some support when thinking about the survivors that are left within the organization and how to help them navigate through all of this change. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we're just going to head right into our first question. And so, Catherine, I'm going to kick things off with you and ask, what are the best ways HR and leaders can show employee care during times of uncertainty?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren, and excited to kind of dive into this topic today. I know we've got a lot to cover over the next 50 minutes. I love the word care in this question. I think, when we think about uncertainty and the different scenarios that you just laid out, so, technology, layoffs, mergers, there's all sorts of different scenarios that we can think of that create uncertainty. But care is really important when we think about our role as HR leaders and managers in the organization. It's something we can uniquely do. And so I think of this in kind of three different areas. First, I would say empathy. So, this word we probably will hear a few times today. The second I think about is resourcing, and the third is well-being. So just to kind of break those down a little bit more. So when we think about empathy, I think we overuse that word a lot, but I like to think about this as really recognizing individuals' challenges. So your reaction, your challenge, where you are sitting in this moment is going to be different than where I'm sitting in this moment, and recognizing that we are in different places or have different backgrounds or experiences that bring us to this place, and how we are hearing or working through a moment of uncertainty, and being able to hold that space for people and to appreciate and understand where they are is really incredibly important when we think about empathy. So this comes in, like I said, holding space, asking questions, being curious. Those are all important when I think about empathy. When I think about resourcing, from an HR perspective, we've got a lot of resources in our toolkit, and, having spent time in a benefits director role, I learned very quickly that we can have the most amazing resources, but if it's not annual enrollment or, it's not an emergency, a lot of times we forget, because this is our day job, but it's not necessarily the day job of everybody else in the organization. And so really going back to the toolkit and saying, what are the resources that we have, available, and how can we remind people of some of those, whether it's EAP and benefits or communications, when we communicate something out, creating a repository of communications, for instance, can be really helpful from a resource perspective. Just because we communicate something once doesn't mean that it's, landed and remembered forever. And so, how do we create communication spaces where we put, prior communications or FAQs or a place to ask questions. The last thing I would say just around resourcing is skill development. We know that this is important and continues to be important as we think about just the shifting roles that we are all taking on. So whether it's a merger that happens and now we have new jobs, or it is, a technology that's introduced and we're removing tasks, there is a skill development element that we need to be thinking about. And so how can we resource that as HR professionals? And the last piece, that well-being piece, which, I'm personally very passionate about. I'm not talking about apps and, all those things are great. What I'm thinking about more is just how do we make decisions around well-being in light of some of the new factors that are in play. So, if a technology has shifted how we're doing a piece of work, does that shift how we think about where we're doing the work? What flexibility means in that regard? Has it shifted the workload for people? So are we addressing workloads for people? And these are really great ways that we can show care, that we are understanding where people are, that we're helping resource to them, and that we are thinking about how this is impacting, their day and their ability to get work done.
Oh my gosh, so many great things you just said there, Ani. what
Exactly.
are your comments? Do you have any responses to what Catherine was saying, or do you have some additional insights to provide?
I really loved what you were saying, Catherine. I do think we're going to hear empathy a lot during the next 40 somewhat minutes. But I think that for me, the definition of empathy and how I action it in my day-to-day is, I think, one of the most powerful things we can do as HR leaders during any time of uncertainty, as Catherine mentioned. Yes, layoffs, but there's other moments of uncertainty. It's really presence, intentional, visible leaderships, because I've learned that employees don't always need us to have all of the answers. I think everyone is well aware that we're sometimes navigating a good amount of unknown. But I think really demonstrating that we're walking with them, not ahead of them, not kind of blindly expecting followership. I think those are really key for me. And I go back to a little bit of the research, and there's a lot of research. I think most prominent is the McKinsey research that's very recent, that I think that the employees' perceptions of leadership empathy correlates really strongly with trust and the discretionary effort that's so critical in really trying to recover from such a massive change that the organization is trying to digest. So I think it's, care is not about overpromising calm. It's much more about modeling steadiness, humanity, and just leading with that empathy again.
Yeah, I like that. And it just made me think about shared experiences, right? So we know that shared experiences can drive deeper relationships, greater trust. And so being, showing that we are, part of this and working alongside with them.
We're navigating it too. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a whole nother question.
Yeah.
Around HR, we're not only, helping, work through the change, but we're experiencing it too. I am a big fan of, leaders that show some level of vulnerability, just really create a deeper connection. And connection to me is so incredibly important when we're thinking about uncertainty, because, I hear this word untethered. I heard it from somebody the other day, and it just really kind of struck me as like, yeah, when things are uncertain, it feels like you're untethered, and being connected to people, the organization, your leader, each other can be very grounding when things are uncertain, even if we don't have all the answers yet.
And when we're talking about layoffs, for example, what are some ways that we can re-engage or sustain employee engagement after an event like that?
I'm happy to kick this one off. I mean, I think, the tools that we use during an event or a change to engage employees are often really the same tools that we use in good times, right? And I say good or normal times. The fundamentals are really the same. So, we need to be thinking about things like clarity. Do I understand what my job is? Do I have the resources to do my job? Do I feel like I'm growing, that I'm being recognized, that there's meaning and purpose in what I'm doing at work? All those things are still important, and even more so after a change, right? Because we almost have to think of it as like re-onboarding somebody, right? And those are all the, wonderful things that we do when somebody joins our organization, and everything's shiny and bright. And we almost have to re-enroll and re-onboard people after an event happens. But some specific things that I would think about just, in a moment of change, and how do we kind of sustain or re-engage during those moments? I think context is really important. Understanding why why this is happening, what's happened, why it's happening, and really kind of understanding the lay of the land. I think having a timeline around steps is important. So what can I expect when? You know, whether that's, communication cadences, maybe there's like a regular, update around the change. When will decisions be made? What decisions, need to be made? Kind of understanding that timeline can be incredibly just empowering for people. Setting a vision for the future, even if it's, murky in between, but like, again, it kind of goes back to the context a little bit. Like, we know we are doing this because there is a greater vision out here, and getting people to see kind of what direction we're moving into can be really helpful. I think I love when I think about engagement, how are we getting people activated? How do we not just, huddle in a room and do all the work and make all the decisions, but how can we engage people in the change, in the process? I love this term, action absorbs anxiety. I say it all the time, to myself and to people that I work with, but I believe in that. Like, how can we get people involved in the change and feeling like, let's help make some decisions. I think about this funny little, it seems kind of funny now talking about it, but we made years ago, moved from one location of offices to, another building. And, there's a lot of hustle and bustle and, stress about moving locations. But one of the things that became kind of a fun little activity and really got people excited about the space, believe it or not, was actually naming the meeting rooms of all things. And it became just like a fun little activity, but it felt like, okay, I'm going to be part of this. And it really became a fun activity and engaged people in it and started to build some momentum. It seems small, but it was such a great way to get people involved and connected. So, my last point would just be, if you're going to work on engagement for your team, just make sure that you too are engaged. And taking a moment to kind of reflect on that, I think, is really important, because if you're not engaged, none of this other stuff is really going to matter or land. So, Ani, I don't know what you'd add to that.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I love this. I'd never heard this. Action eliminates anxiety.
Absorbs, yeah.
Absorbs anxiety. And I think for me, that's key. And I tend to focus on three things of how do I do that. And for me, the purpose is to pay down like this emotional debt that has now accrued because this massive negative change happened, right? A riff has happened. And so for me, it's about, you have to re-recruit your remaining employees, right? Remind them why they matter, why they joined, why this is a purpose, a goal, a mission that they were drawn to. Invite employees back into the rebuild, which is kind of what you were saying, right? Yes, conference rooms. It might seem like a small thing to do, but I think shared purpose, shared community around the change, it creates forward momentum. And that's really what you want, right? You want to be able to move forward from this impactful, very negatively impactful event that happened. And I think it's also acknowledging the impact. Name it, call it out, and work on that hard truth or truths that it's going to take to rebuild that credibility, right? So I don't think it's about pep talks. I actually think it's about a lot of like consistency, humility, momentum, and really just kind of being purposeful about all of that. I don't think it's a situation where folks bounce back from something like this. It's a slow and intentional process, in my experience, to rebuild and rebuild to a good place, not a new and, far worse place than where we started.
Ani, you just said something that made me think about, just being able to get to that point, acknowledging the change that has happened is really important.
Yeah.
And that's going to take people, a different amount of time, a different process to get through that or process through that change. You know, I'll talk about the change curve probably a little bit later, but, you know, you think about, you know, whether it's working through a change like a merger or working through, you know, a new team that's coming together, or working through grief, quite frankly, it's the same curve, right? And so if we don't work through that fear and that, you know, the beginning pieces of that and through the depression part of it, we will never be able to have the amazing outcome that happens in the end. And so I think as leaders and as HR professionals, this is where we come back to that empathy and that space, and just really understanding that, you know, where you are is going to be very different than where Lauren might be, or somebody else. And so when we can create space to work through that, and or allow them to work through that, we will have amazing, you know, much better long-standing outcomes on the back end. And I think sometimes we're just moving so fast. And as HR, we are so ahead of the game sometimes, just because of the nature of the work that we do. We've got to remind ourselves that we've got to get people, you know, through that process to get to where we ultimately need to go.
This reminds me so much of an experience I lived early in my career, where I was not leading, but working within an HR team. And there was very large scale restructuring and reduction in force happening. And there was, you know, kind of all the remaining employees had gathered in a very large conference room. And so you're talking about hundreds of people in the room, and there was so much emotion. And our CHRO at the time made space and just paused for everyone to look around, deal with the emotion of many of my coworkers of many years, perhaps decades, are not here, and really let kind of that, you know, you called it like stages of grief, right? Perhaps we don't have lengthy periods, but we can't just run through our processes as well. So to really make space for that toll that this has taken on individuals. We spent a lot of hours with our coworkers and our peers and colleagues. And so I agree with you. It is a, you know, the grief model is a pretty relevant model, perhaps not entire, you know, kind of a crossover, but a large portion of that Venn diagram crosses over in terms of how one processes it. So I really like that connection, Catherine, a lot.
Well, it's a very powerful example, Ani. Thank you both for that. I'm going to move on to our next question. Before I do that, just a reminder that if you do have any insights, comments, questions, go ahead and pop it into the Q&A. We're having some issues with chat, so the Q&A feature is functioning. We've actually got several questions coming in. I'm excited to answer some of those when we get to the Q&A portion here. But I'm thinking maybe this next question might answer one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A. So as former HR leaders ourselves, you know, we know firsthand how important a leader's words and actions are during times of uncertainty and change. Ani, you just gave us a really great example of, you know, what leadership looks like in moments like this. So how can we as leaders and separately as HR professionals keep this top of mind in the moments that matter, and address employee concerns accordingly? Ani, why don't you go ahead and kick things off?
Absolutely. I think that in those moments, words become emotional architecture, and you have to carry that responsibility and, you know, be a steward of that. And so I feel like when employees feel destabilized, they cling to like what we say and even to what we do. And then if there's a gap between that gap becomes the organizational mistrust that's then built, right? So something that I always try to adhere to is during times of change, everything I say is strategy. Everything I do is culture. And so if I say I care, but I fail to address things that Catherine brought up as we were kind of kicking this session off around bandwidth, right? Resourcing, around the stress of this or the clarity, I'm not going to have much integrity moving forward. So I feel that our role as HR leaders at any level of the organization, again, whether it's at the very top of the HR leadership, chain, or at the, I would say, kind of the front lines, right? Business partners. I think our role as HR is to help leaders stay self-aware, introspective, and we need to coach them in real time. Great messaging, and I love internal communication. I'm a huge fan of internal communication, but we also need to do a lot of coaching to ensure that these leaders are embodying that message. Just saying it is really surface level, and I think employees pick up on that very quickly. And so for me, it's the words and the actions not only go hand in hand, but they have to be in lockstep if the trust is going to get rebuilt.
And Catherine, before you comment, just a question for both of you. How do you get those leaders that might be hesitant? Like, how do you get them engaged? How do you get them engaged versus like teasing them, pulling them along? Like, what tactics may you have used in the past that maybe has been productive or helpful in moments like that? Because not all leaders rise to the occasion, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And I think that it's not even just all leaders, right? But the leaders that are staying within the organization after a moment like this, they all come in with different experience levels, right? And different aptitudes in people management. And so for me, what's really worked, and I'm so curious to know, what tactics and tools you guys have used, but for me, what's really worked is pre-communication and preparation. So I feel like leaders need to digest this information, get all of their questions. As we talked about how we as HR people are like feeling it and doing it all at once, right? Mm-hmm. But we're a little bit more trained in doing that. As, functional leaders, it's not the core of their role. So I feel like we need to help them digest this as an employee of the organization. Then we need to help them digest it as a leader who now has to take some actions and help them build a plan. So share that message, ask them to share what action items within their business units, departments, etc., really correlate with reinforcing this message, and then help them build not just a communication model, but maybe like an actual communication plan, right? Like a whole cadence around when are you going to do it? How often are you going to do it? Are you going to have informal skip levels? Are you going to, do virtual firesides? Like, what are the methodologies that you're going to use? And I tend to insert ideas where I feel that they have some gaps, right? Have you considered also taking, stuff like this? And I want, by the time that the change is announced org level, for my leaders to already have their plan fully fleshed out and prepared to execute. So pre-communication and pre-readiness for me are keys for leadership.
For sure. Preparation is key, I think, in a lot of these situations for leaders, because like you said, they come in all shapes and sizes after events that are pretty impactful to an organization. And it's really helpful to help guide them as much as you're guiding the employees and you're even maybe guiding your peers. So Catherine, any comments before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I like what Ani shared, and I think I would just I agree. Unfortunately, we can't always have this luxurious timeline, so I want to be realistic. Sometimes it's quite quick, but I do think whatever your timeline is that you're working in, preparing with the key talking points and having managers have a moment to digest and say, what do I think about this? Like, what is the impact to my team? Again, kind of, I'm just going to push that empathy down, right? Like, so how's my team going to react to this? What does this mean for my team? And having, even if it's overnight, maybe that's all they get, or, a few hours, but like making sure that we are asking them, or, to take a moment and think about this, because the worst thing that you can have, well, maybe not the worst, but one of the worst things you can have is a manager that says, let me read you the talking points from communications on what's happening because I don't agree with it. Or, a totally not bought in manager, right? And so we have to give them as much courtesy as possible to be able to relay the message in an authentic way. And it doesn't have to be perfect, and it can still be painful. It still can be hurt, it still can be a lot for a manager to manage. But sometimes I'll go back to that vulnerability in measured amount. We're in this together. I mean, we will figure this out together. And, being able to say that, or being able to say, I don't have an answer to a question, can be really empowering for a manager. And so I think sometimes giving permission to say, if you have questions, like, where do you go if you have a question? Where do you, go if something comes up that's not in the talking points that you hadn't thought about? The best response, I'll go back to my good old training days of, as a trainer, I didn't know all the answers, but I had to go find out. And that's how you build that trust and credibility.
Yeah, one of the examples that I can remember from a client of ours a couple of years back, they had a large restructure, had some changes that were made. They provided the talking points. They did have a runway. It wasn't a long period of time, but it was at least some notice that was being able to be provided to key members of the leadership team. They also offered coaching sessions. So, you can offer coaching sessions where your HR team are the coaches. You can offer coaching sessions with independent third parties who, if your leadership team is quite large and you need extra hands, that could be a great way to do it. But just even offering the coaching sessions not only shows the leadership team that you're supportive of them assisting and kind of rolling out the change and speaking to the change, but it also allows them a lifeline if they're drowning a little bit, in accepting the change, or in how to communicate this to people, how to be empathetic. Sometimes people have a sense of what that is because of their own experiences, how they like others to react to them. But they don't necessarily understand the various ways that employees might prefer to handle change, or what type of support they may need. And so those coaching sessions went a long way. I think, if I recall, about 40% of the leaders took them up on it. And it was ultimately leaders within the organization that were either new leaders, or they were new to the organization. And so they really wanted to get that pulse of, okay, what type of changes have occurred in the past? How have they been received? How have they been delivered? And I just think that additional context can add such strength to a leader's confidence as they move forward and support the organization through large changes.
Lauren, I would just, in similar vein, I think pulling in some of your more experienced managers as you're preparing them in communication. So, somebody who can give kind of real voice to, this is how I'm going to help approach this as a manager. And so it's not just HR or corporate communications that's saying this is what you need to communicate, but a manager that might be in the business that can say, and this is, how I'm going to approach it. So it's another perspective, if you will. That's a credible source.
It is. I mean, especially when peers can rely on peers and really feel the power of that support. Sometimes that's even better than us HR folks providing them with the assistance and support that they need. So, as HR professionals, it's our opportunity to facilitate that. So that is absolutely a great way to do it too. All right, next question here. So when we talk about transparent communication and two-way dialogue, what does that actually look like? So maybe we can go over some examples, or we can elaborate a little bit more on what that actually looks like. Ani, I will start with you, and then we'll hand it over to Catherine.
I think that in moments that matter, right, it's kind of easy for us to slip into policy speak, or I call it that PR safe language, right? Where we're just really talking about a message. And I think that we are, also employees of the organization. And I always go back to, what do I really want? And I think that it's universal that we want realness, right? A level of honesty and realness. So a framework that I think helps for me is to pause. I don't rush to respond if I don't have clarity. I think that ensuring a smooth response is the equivalent of having a fast response. A quick response ends up being sloppy and messy, and then it's just kind of very difficult to navigate. And I always try to keep it top of mind. Again, going back to empathy, what does this feel like for an employee right now? I've had time to digest certain things. I've had access to certain information that maybe has calmed my anxieties, right? But where is an employee right now at this moment? And I like to anchor that. So what are the pieces we want to reinforce right now? We want to reinforce stability in the business. We want to reinforce purpose, shared purpose, right? And we want to reinforce safety to a certain degree, right? That this happened. We collectively, we are the survivors. We are safe. It's going to be a difficult period of time, and we're all going to have to adjust and relearn certain things, right? But that we are in a moment of safety. And then I think that we have to act. I mean, the tone, the language, and the behaviors have to work together, right? Or else, again, that trust gap starts to widen. So from an HR perspective, after a big moment, I'm a huge believer in taking a people pulse, learning what are we hearing, what are the points of confusion, what are the points of anger, and what are the points of unity, and what contexts can we as HR professionals who've heard from multiple employees in various parts of the organization, what can we add? What insight can we add? Because I'm a believer that we as HR leaders are the meaning makers, right? We are taking all this information, positive information, negative information, fear based information, and we need to tie it together. We need to pull insights and themes from that. And so we need to make meaning out of all of this and help the rest of the organization digest it. And I saw in our Q&A some questions around how do I bring managers along for all of this? And I fully recognize that that's the hardest part. And I think that, and not to oversimplify it, but I find that leading with data, bringing these various points of information, whether it's from, kind of anonymous formats or open forums, or again, a survey, et cetera, bringing all of those things together and really sharing that with leadership and getting their input as to what some of these data points mean. Because I think if we just push out, here's what it said and here's what you're going to do, that's when the buy-in is, I don't know, I was told to say this, I don't really know if I buy it. But if you co-created that plan along with the HR team, you were party to it, then you're more apt to engage with it, you're more apt to be supportive of it. And in the face of some opposition, pushback, you're more apt to know how to defend it and speak to it, right? Because you were a part of the creation of it. I'll pause there. I feel like those are kind of the big things I focus on there.
So Ani, I like this. I'm a big fan of employee listening. I think that it's, I mean, in HR, I mean, we have to remember what we're here to do, which is to really optimize, the people side of this business. And we have to serve our people, and we have to understand where they are. And you listed off a number of ways that we can kind of understand where people are from a data standpoint. I love, whether you've got champions or culture carriers, maybe more informally, kind of some of the people in the organization that can give you a good feel for what's happening, and your managers know those people that are really in tune with what's happening in the organization. And I would leverage them so that you have, to your point, kind of build your plan in a very informed way. So I think, really understanding who those people are and pulling them in. I actually, even previewing some communications will open up your blind spots, right? Will help you to be able to address some of the big concerns head on, and can really drive just greater transparent communication. So I'm a big fan of how can we find the right sources to inform our communications, and how can we use them to also then help carry the message out. Like, I helped inform this, change or whatever, and I believe in it. And now you have a culture carrier that's deep in your organization, or a manager deep in your organization that says, I'm bought in, and this is why. And that can be really powerful. One other thought, Lauren, back to your question on just two-way dialogue, because I think about ways that we can help managers, and this is just a really great nugget, I think, around getting managers to be intentional of asking and not telling. And so how are we asking questions in an open way? How are we asking questions that, sound or begin with, what, how, and when? And not saying, can, do, or have. So, like, for example, like, do you need help is different than how can I help? Because if I ask you, do you need help? I'm your manager. There is some power dynamic there. And I don't want to show weakness, particularly in a moment of uncertainty, right? Because I don't want to show any weakness. And so when you say, do you need help? Nope, I'm good. I got it. I am perfect. No harm here. Like, don't worry about me. Versus, how can I help? I know this is a lot. That feels more inviting, right? And I can't just say no. I got to come up with a couple words at least. So there's just a different, if we approach in a more open question format, then we can start to get some more detail and really, back to the point we made earlier, really start to understand where people are and where they in this, as they're working through their uncertainty. And I think that can be much more rich than saying, than being more directive and telling them, where they should be, because that's making all sorts of assumptions.
For sure. Thank you. Oh my gosh, we have so many great questions in here, but right before we cut to Q&A, can we just spend 2 minutes on this last question here that I have for you? How do we as HR professionals help employees move through the change rather than get stalled by the change? I think some of the things we've talked about thus far kind of lend itself to that question, but is there any last minute comments that you would like to add in these next few minutes before we head to Q&A? Either one of you can go. Either one. Whoever's got something to share.
I mean, I feel like I'm going to be a broken record a little bit. I do think it's just, creating the space that will help people move through it. Over listening, if that's a word. And, I know it sounds, like something everybody says, the over communication, but communication can happen in so many different ways. And that's, whether it's your literal open door policy to being, present, being in the office more as we're going through these changes, or, not canceling your one-on-ones, even if there's nothing on the agenda, doing just drop-ins and check-ins with those open questions. Like, all these things can be really impactful. I think creating even opportunity for people to connect. So not even social connection can be so incredibly important in times like this, because I think back to, I grew up in financial services, and mergers were, kind of normal in that space. And having gone through a major merger myself, what helped me and often was just the quick, 10-minute check-ins with my peers, with my team, with my leaders, just to like get it out for a second. Here's my heart. Okay, I've said it. I didn't need you to solve it. I just needed to say it, and now we can move forward. And sometimes we just need that space, which is, if I can leave you with that.
I think
Yeah, Catherine, I call that keeping the emotional process visible. And that's our job, right? Just to keep it visible and keep it tactile, create that space, make it okay to say it. And it's really all we can do.
And also too, like, helping guide employees to maybe understand where they fit now that, we were one way, right? Then we have this significant change, or this impact, this external impact we're dealing with, where do they fit after, right? Like how are the things that they're working on? How are they powerful now, just like they were before? Who are the people who, might need to recalibrate some of what they focus on in terms of their responsibility, their role, their goals, all of those things, I think too, are, something that we naturally are going to equip leaders to be able to help champion through the process. But, I think that, those waters get murky when employees don't fully understand or get the right messaging from their leadership, of, okay, now what?
Yeah.
Now how do I contribute? Now where do I fit?
Thank you for saying that, Lauren, because I think I don't want us to sound like we're sitting in this like muck and, depressive state. Like, absolutely, when you are ready to be more, when people are coming up the acceptance side of this change curve, like, let's get to work. Like, this is where, we're rebuilding processes, we're delegating work out, we are, really really solidifying that vision more, asking the question, how do you see yourself in this, in the future state of the organization? I'm not telling you where you are. I'm asking you, how do you see yourself? How do you see your skills being, best used in this? Recognizing that, where they are going in the organization. I think those can be really empowering and just, very future focused.
It gives them agency, doesn't it? Like a sense of agency. Yeah.
For sure. Well, thank you. Like I said, we've got several questions here, but before we head into that, I just want to kind of review some of our key takeaways from today. So I kind of look at it as three themes that continue to come up through conversation, through the questions that we discussed, and I'm sure there will be some more here in the Q&A. But, really strengthening your skills to adapt to change helps you and the employees you support. So that can be you as a leader, that can be you as an HR professional, but really, thinking about the ways that you can be helpful, the way you can be supportive, and kind of sharpening and honing in those skills are going to be really critical. That proactive communication and two-way dialogue that we talked about, it really builds trust and fosters that psychological safety during what can be a very disruptive time for an organization. And employees who connect their individual roles to their personal goals, organizational mission, societal impact, they can find meaning even in flux, during this. And it's important to equip leaders with the right talking points, as well as the right actions and behaviors to exhibit, during these times of change. But it's also very important for us as HR professionals and us as leaders to take that on ourselves as well. And if we notice that an employee is not necessarily, fully engaged or connecting after major changes within an organization, let's take it upon ourselves to help them and move them through the change, as opposed to watching them get stalled by the change. So I know I keep teasing you. We're going into the Q&A, I promise. But the post-webinar materials that you're going to receive as a participant today, you are going to receive a recording of this session should you like to revisit it or share it with any of your colleagues or connections. We're also going to be providing you with links to 2 downloads that we will have available to you first as participants of this webinar. These downloads, this content was created by both Catherine and Ani. One is mainly focused on a leader's guide to navigating uncertainty, and the second is a framework for communicating workforce reductions, and really is a very nice framework to really communicate any sort of change. You can just kind of sub in and out some of the language that you see in the template. So we're excited to provide that to you post-webinar. You'll receive that in an email either today or tomorrow, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. All right, with our remaining time here, let's go ahead and answer some of the questions that we have here in the Q&A. I'm just going to pick a few because we did address some of them through some of our answers previously, but there's some really great ones in here and I don't want to miss skipping out. All right. Now I'm having trouble picking which one might be the best one. Okay. This one's, I think, could be worthy of us spending a few minutes on. One attendee had said, we are a fully remote organization. Are there any tips to keeping a remote workforce fully engaged? And because I know we did talk a little bit about, some of the examples of our, of our past, bringing people together in a conference room or assuming that maybe leaders have, more personal access to some of their employees, whether it be on site or at different locations for an organization. If it's a fully remote workforce, how can we translate some of those tips and those tricks and those insights that we've provided today into a more remote focused environment? Either of you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start. So I'll go back to the shared experiences piece. I think that's one thing to think about. So, what does that look like from a work perspective, but also from a social non-work. I don't want to say non-work because it is your work colleagues, but how do you create, when you have shared connections, you're creating deeper connection and deeper relationships. So, maybe a non-work focused is like a volunteer event or something like that. Are there opportunities where you can do something remotely together? So, this makes me think back to the old COVID, like virtual happy hours that we used to have. And I'm not saying we need to have a bunch of those, but can we, perhaps create content, that can be used or connect people with people that, have like a shared problem that they're solving. I think like hackathons or things like that, those types of things. And there's technology that can help create more virtual environments that we can be connected in. So, that comes to mind. I would also say, recognition is another one that is so easy to put in, that gets lost. I think we can look at this in a virtual environment as well. How are we creating forums for recognition? Whether that's from leadership or through peer connections. There's lots of technologies out there that can support recognition. But if I'm sitting in, my little, home office here in Atlanta and my leadership is in New York, it's pretty amazing if I got, a call or a little, gift or whatever from my leadership to say, hey, I'm so glad you're here. I loved what you did on XYZ project. And, I can't wait to see you at our annual in person, which may be months out, but at least we're still creating that connection. So, this is like one of the age-old questions I feel like we've had over the last 5 years. And it it maybe looks a little bit different, but the elements of it are the same. So we just go back to what are those engagement factors of connection, purpose in our work, recognition, knowing what's expected of me. And yeah. So Ani, I don't know what you would add to that.
Yeah, my last three corporate in-house roles were either fully remote or transitioning the business to be fully remote. And some practical tools. So I agree with Catherine, everything you're saying, like 100% agree with it. Some practical things I did to help bring that message to life was, and I was just jotting it down as you were saying it. So we created a new hire buddy program where it was a cross-functional buddy, more long-term employee, different department, certainly different geographic location, that was tasked with helping them, just kind of come up to speed on the culture and how we work and what some of the norms are, and not so much about the content of their job. I used to do a lot of virtual coffees. And so we would kind of send employees, like little Starbucks gift cards, et cetera, and then create, again, these pods for virtual coffees that were very cross-functional and not work-related. And the whole goal was for our employees to get to know one another in a forum that was still content-rich, but meant to be driven by whatever they desired to talk about. We had the, kind of a few policies that we implemented to help ensure that kind of FaceTime. And one of the basics was cameras always on in meetings. And that helped kind of create, so I could say, oh my God, Lauren, you got a haircut, or it's different. It's kind of those little small touches, right? That kind of, it's those little human connections that make us feel connected to our coworkers. We really increased, I want to say almost 2-3x increased our communication. And that included having, weekly kind of business reviews. We call them WBRs, where all leaders were able to dial in and just understand how did the last week go in terms of, sales, revenue, just overall numbers. We created more all hands meetings, much more frequent than we used to have it before we were remote. We also created a lot more frequent AMAs, right? Ask Me Anythings, that were driven not just by one leader or by HR, but a variety of leaders. And so employees could really target their questions to, if you have a lot of questions about the financial stability, well, you might want to dial into the AMA with the CFO and the VP of Finance to really kind of, get the skinny on things. And the kind of the last one was, and this is very budget driven, so I fully recognize it's not something we can really do, but I tried to find some tentpole events, maybe once or twice a year, that I could really galvanize the workforce to get them together, or find a midpoint that allowed for the team to get together and really build that momentum. And as someone who grew up in enterprise software, my mind goes to the yearly kickoffs, right? When sales organizations kick off the year, you're setting a tone, you're setting kind of the goals and the message for the year. And I found that those tentpole events enabled me to, drive the message home, drive our purpose home, and then sort of send everyone off with a renewed sense of commitment and purpose to the mission we were hoping to accomplish.
Thank you for that. We've got 1 minute left. So unfortunately, we are not going to be able to get to all of these questions. Thank you so much for submitting them, though. It looked like we answered a lot through conversation. If we did not answer a question that you are dying to know what the insights and feedback are of Ani and Catherine, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'm just going to share our contact information here. You can reach out to Next Level Benefits either through our website or at info@nlbenefits.com. You can follow us on LinkedIn or YouTube. And for those who are attending this webinar for SHRM PDCs, the activity ID is 25-567CH. This will be provided to you in the email that you will receive post-webinar. And if you are watching this recording on our website, feel free to jot this down, enter it into your SHRM recertification portal, and or reach out to us with any specific questions you may have. We're happy to answer for you. Thank you to everyone who has joined us and participated with us today. We very much appreciate it. Thank you to Ani and Catherine for their knowledge, and thank you so much for attending our webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.